Hey there. Welcome again to First Look. Thanks for being here with us this week. I don't know why I say being with us here this week. You're just here with me. There's no us. There's no production team. It's just you and I. So this week we're continuing in Luke. The lectionary just has us moving forward. And before I forget, let me just say I'm sorry about the picnic. The can't control the weather, but you all were really good sports in participating in worship via an online experience. At this point, it's kind of like a throwback, you know? I mean, it kind of makes you feel like there's nostalgic for 2020, you know, those good old days of pandemic. Uh, oh, anyway, thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. I didn't want to have to use that recording for as many of us, but that's just the way the cookie crumbled. So we will try to make this coming week as picnic-like as we can. But we have four people who are joining the church this Sunday. So please, be aware of that and participate where you can. We'll have a fellowship time afterwards. So it will be the most picnic type atmosphere we can make it while being indoors. So that's very fun. So, Luke chapter 14, moving on, moseying along. Um, I think one of the things I like about looking at the middle parts of Gospels is that you really get this kind of heart of who Jesus is. Because we tend to spend, and rightly so, we tend to spend a lot of time, of course, especially in a book like Luke, in the beginning, where we look at things like his birth narrative and um, the kind of the infancy stories and the baptism and those sort of beginning things. And then we obviously spend a lot of time at the end because that's where the death and resurrection and ascension are. Why wouldn't we do that? But the vast majority of where we get to know who Jesus is really in this middle part, and it's the portion of it where we're really trying to understand not only who he is, but we're trying to understand his mission, right? Because you've got these initial narratives that give us a sense of his identity, right? A sense of self, his origin story, so to speak. If we were talking about this as a superhero, that's how we would describe it, as his origin story. And then you have this sort of climactic way of ending, which gives us is sort of future focused, right? Because salvation, of course, and eternal natures, our eternal nature is all future focused. It's all focused on what would happen after his life. But in the middle of his life, we really get the meat of a lot of what our life should be about. We have our own origin stories. We have our own things that form us as people, um, and we work through all of that stuff. And we have this ultimate kind of idea of where we're headed, and this hope that we have in God. But then we have all this stuff in the middle that we're trying to figure out. And so much of what Jesus is doing is describing and preparing people for a central concept, which is, what is the kingdom of heaven? What is the kingdom of God supposed to be like? Meaning, what are we building here and now that will change the world? And he spends a significant amount of time in the Gospels trying to deconstruct people's understanding of society, of religion, and of their role in the world. Basically, breaking that down, not just to its foundation, but breaking apart the foundations. Um, because all of the ways that he describes that, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, is in very different terms. We're not going to build this on the same foundations that they were built before. It's not going to be built on this hierarchy. It's not going to be built on the haves and the have-nots. It's not going to be built with power in mind, right? It's going to be built in a way where society from the ground up, from the middle out, is completely different, where we're caring for those people on the margins first and foremost, where we're looking at how to be inclusive and hospitable, and then this focus on healing. And Jesus, of course, is healing metaphorically, spiritually, but also physically, meaning that we need to be caring for each other in physical ways. So not only looking at poverty, but looking at how we consider, you know, how we heal each other. And I think at the core, when you look at um, different faith traditions, at their involvement in things like hospitals and other facilities, senior care facilities, that kind of thing, um, we can't deny the places where that becomes, about finances. But I think at their core and their origins, those places are about trying to respond to Jesus as someone who heals. Um, and that's a huge part of the way we understand our identity, I think, as people of faith. So those are the types of things I'm trying to sort of consider and look at, and why I think investing so much time in ordinary time, where we are right now, before we get to Advent, before we get to stewardship season, before we get to Lent, all of those things. We spend this big bulk of time in the middle of the year, in the middle of the gospel, looking at the core of what Jesus is really up to here on earth. So we continue on. Luke chapter 14. It starts in verse 1, and then it jumps down to 7 through 14. So Luke 14, 7 through 14. And it starts with verse 1 just to kind of set the scene. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees, so not a Pharisee, but the leader of the Pharisees, so pretty, right? The leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath. They were watching him closely. So now we kind of get what's happening, right? So and then it drops down and it talks about the guests that were there, right? So now they're watching him closely, and Jesus is kind of doing the same thing. He's figuring out what this scene looks like. So when he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told this parable. So what we understand is that this is a story about power, about class, about hierarchy, about public appearance. It's all of those things, right? And it's how we understand the way that works. And most of that in our society is pretty normal, right? If you were having a dinner party and you had famous people that were there for whatever reasons, whether they were politicians or actors or famous business people, whatever it happened to be, you would probably make sure that person was comfortable. You would probably make sure that person had everything they needed. And when setting things up, they would have a pretty prominent place, and so it's looking at that. Like, it's looking at that as not just as the occasion, but how we value the other person. That's a big deal, right? That's a big way of understanding um, the world as we see it. For instance, and we have to look at that from a systems standpoint. So, like, one part of that could be just looking at it the way I'm trying to describe it. Sometimes we criticize people, athletes, for making a lot of money. Like, so and so makes 25 million or $50 million a year. I think I saw that LeBron James, who is 37, just signed a 2-year extension with the Lakers for $49 million per year. It's, I think, $97 million or something. Now, we can critique that, but what's funny is that we don't spend as much time critiquing the system that still makes that profitable, right? There's a system in place. There's a lot of money in basketball, and there are a lot of people who are not famous that you don't know who make a ton of money and can more than afford to pay LeBron James $49 million a year to do anything. And so when we critique those systems, we have to critique not only the product, i.e., in this case, the person that you know that's receiving the money, but also the system that allows that to happen, but also you and I, because the only reason that any of that can happen is because people tune in, so pick the sport that you like or pick the thing that you like. If you're you love watching the Food Network, or you love the orchestra, or you love, anything where people make, substantial amount of money to do what they do, what do we value in society? And, how do we look at ourselves differently? Is a social worker or a teacher ever going to make as much money as someone who provides us with cool stuff we like? That doesn't mean that that person works harder or not. Like, we understand all these things. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I'm saying when we assign value to things, we have to also look at ourselves and say, why is it that I value this thing more than this thing? These are just stuff for us to think about. So that's part of what Jesus is talking about, and I would be remiss to not mention it at some level when we talk about this scripture in a sermon. So he noticed the guests and how they chose the places of honor. Then he told this parable. This is in verse 8 of chapter 14. When you were invited by someone to a wedding banquet. Now, I'll have to do some research on wedding banquets at the time, right? Because that's probably a little bit different than the weddings that you and I go to. When I go to a wedding, no one has a place of honor for me. And usually now, the only people who have places of honor are the people who are in the wedding party, right? They're not special people. They just happen to be close to the bride and the groom or whoever. Okay. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. That's an interesting little critique there. And the host who invites both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He also, to the one who was invited, he said, there we go. Verse 12, here we go, starting again, take 3. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, or your brothers, or your relatives, or your rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And then there's the parable of a great dinner, and that's kind of parallel to that. That's a really interesting passage, given all that I just said, because it makes us think about what we value and how we value ourselves. And that value, in this case, comes from people telling us, people seeing in us what is valuable, instead of us assuming that we are. So some of what I said or some of what I was kind of talking about in my LeBron James example, um, is I think it is worthy of us looking at from this perspective, while some of it that I was saying is really just something for us to think about in general. Because what we're doing in that LeBron James example, or in that Food Network example, or however you know think about that, is looking at the how we place value and where, and how we place value in ourselves, right? And so some of it is this kind of status critique, but some of it also then is layered into that is this how we value ourselves critique. It's a humility kind of critique. And then you get down to the other part about the luncheon part. Like if you're going to invite people, don't do it because you're going to be repaid, but do it for out of the goodness of how you can help other people. All of those things tie together, especially when you read the next story. All of that ties together in the ways that we tend to um, look at society and engage with it. And I think what Jesus is trying to get people to think about, given how many different things he's kind of mentioning there, right? He's mentioning status, he's mentioning our own value and humility, and he's mentioning what we think we'll get in return, right? Like part of the reason why LeBron James gets $49 million a year isn't because the owners of the team really want to do well by him and his children. It's because they believe they'll get their money back in terms of viewerships and endorsements, and it's an investment, right? It's an investment in another person that you believe will benefit you ultimately, and that's the core of how that works, right? Anything you see a company do, or you see someone with a lot of resources do, we assume that they are doing because they believe that whatever they're investing in will ultimately pay dividends for them, literally. And part of what Jesus is talking about is breaking that system at its core. So when he talks about, you know, hey, don't start where you think you're going, where you deserve to be. Don't start there. Because ultimately, you can always be replaced, but start with a sense of humility, and then allow other people to show you how valuable you really are. And at the same time, value other people for who they are, not because of what they can do for you. And that's a lot of sort of abstract thinking at once in one little moment. But you also have to remember the audience that he's talking to. So I realized that I threw out a whole bunch of different analogies and a whole bunch of different things to think about. But that's what Jesus is doing for his audience. He's being invited there by the leader of the Pharisees, right? And you probably don't get to that place without some sort of good treatment, right? Like knowing how to work a crowd, knowing the right things to say, being really good at your profession, being faithful, maybe knowing the right people, maybe being married into the right families, all those types of things. And so that person, the leader of the Pharisees, has known in that society a certain level of privilege, and has also earned their place at that table, but is also someone who is called upon to value society, to spread goodness, to spread the God, the word of God, to reflect God's love and humility in the world. And, you know, Jesus being there with those Pharisees, even though he was being watched very carefully, is still this, it was supposed to be kind of an honor that he was there. And he speaks directly to the the people in that room who, as much as they might talk about humility and who might talk about giving and who might lead the people in terms of faith, still need some pretty direct, hard lessons when it comes to how they understand the way that value works. And that's why I was using all those analogies about, you know, what we invest in, why people invest in us, how we get our return on investment. Like, we think in such economic terms. When it comes to what we put into things, what we get out of things, we think in terms of like that. And that mindset is so ingrained in us that it really affects everything we do, right? Like, for instance, I was realizing, I was trying to put one of those things on your phone where you can um, keep track of your steps for the day. Like, it kind of has a pedometer in there, and it tells you, like, oh, you've gone 10,000 steps. And I was trying to get I was trying to, like, walk more and get my steps in and, like, make sure that I was, like, being, active and stuff. And so I thought keeping track of them would be helpful. And I realized that as soon as I put that on my phone, I started doing something just to have the kind of the honor of reaching these certain plateaus. But then I also realized that I was doing exactly what the people who make the phone am hoping I would do, which is find another reason to have my phone on me at all times. Because if I walked a mile and came back and there were a bunch of steps that I took, then, but my phone was sitting on the desk and not sitting in my pocket, then I wasn't earning anything, right? I wasn't, like, earning steps. Because ultimately, of course, the only reason that the iPhone people do anything is so that so that I'll use the phone more and more, right? And it's not like they're helping me. They're giving me another good reason to always have my phone in my pocket. And I felt like a sucker because I fell right into that. I mean, I was walking, like, from the back of the house to the front of the house, and I literally picked up the phone so that those steps would count. Not because, I was going to be healthier that day or whatever, but, like, because I wanted the steps to count. And that was part of how I valued it. And that, after a while, it makes you realize how much we think about getting something for doing anything. I could be drinking water right now, but for some reason I think I should drink coffee because at least I'll get some caffeine out of it and I'll get another little boost. It's like we're always trying to figure out how to economize our actions. How do I get the most out of this thing? And you start to wonder about that. Not because any of that stuff is inherently bad. I don't think my life is going to break down because I had my phone in my pocket while I took a walk instead of not having my phone in my pocket. But it does make you think about the way you see the world. Because then you only start to care about people if they can do something for you. And we only invest in people then as much as we think we're going to get back. For instance, I may spend a lot of time talking with the staff and investing time in the staff because I want to make sure that the staff, my colleagues, do their work well and feel supported by me, right? Consciously or not, I do care about them as individuals, but I also care about the economy of what they're doing. Part of my job is making sure that they're doing work that the church values. And where we don't always invest time, for instance, is when we're giving our time away. And here's what I mean. We say we go to some place where we're going to serve the poor, or we're going to serve a meal. We don't always spend a whole lot of time investing in what's your name and what's your story and whatever, because that slows us down, right? We can't give out as many things to people if we're slowing down and investing in them and caring about them. Because what we really care about far too often is just we want to say that we did the good thing without really investing a whole lot in those people, because we don't assume that those people can really do much for us. They're not going to be our friends. They're not going to end up, giving us anything that we need. They're not going to invest back in us. You may discount any of the things I just said, and say, no, that's not why I do this. No, it's, whatever. But I think part of the reason that Jesus does this, and part of the reason that I'm trying to look at this from as many different angles as possible, is because I think that we are supposed to look at ourselves as critically as possible and try to understand where sometimes we go wrong, but what traps we fall into. Like, that's just a part of, I think, being a person of faith. And as much as I think I feel like I've probably rambled my way through this, which I didn't really mean to do, when I look at this passage and I look at all the nuances of it, where Jesus is, who he's talking to, the layers of the analogies that he makes, they can't be analyzed with one kind of angle, right? It's not just, here's what this story means and go ahead and apply it. There's a lot of different pieces to this that take a lot of time to analyze. And so I was trying to name as many of them as I noticed in the 27 minutes that we've been sitting here talking. And that, I think, is kind of the brilliance of what Jesus does. And I think what's infuriating is because Jesus gives you this quick analogy of this, this dinner that people are invited to, and a parable to go along with it. And in a few sentences, he gives chapters in books worth of thought. And I think our job is to give the right, an appropriate amount of time then to actually respond to them and think about them and look at all of those angles. And that's why we visit these stories so many times, because there's so much to them. So I said a lot of stuff there in 28 minutes. And some of that might stick, and we'll see where I head with the sermon. But I wanted to give you as many ways of trying to think about and latch on to what Jesus is doing in this story. So thank you for doing that with me. Thanks for thinking through this. You might have to pause and go back and forward in this, time to kind of think about different pieces of that story that I brought out, but hopefully it's worth it. I appreciate you doing this with me. It's a first look for a reason. It's not all fleshed out yet, so you're doing that work with me. So thanks for being here. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you next time for another first look. Take care.